All right, welcome back to the Great Hall. Welcome back to in-person lectures. Really excited to be back doing this in person again. Delighted that our first lecture of the in-person lecture series again is Dr. Chad Wellmon from the University of Virginia, who's going to be speaking about the liberal arts in a disenchanted age. Chad Wellmon is a professor of German studies and history at the University of Virginia, where he teaches and writes on intellectual history, the history of education and technology, and media and social theory. His published work includes books on the history of anthropology, the history of print, the emergence of the research university, and other topics. He also led a 7-year effort to reform UVA's undergraduate general education curriculum, which we heard a little bit about at dinner. He's got a lot of interesting stories about this one. He's principal of Brown College, UVA's oldest residential college. Want to add that we are going to move into room 14, which is the room on this side over there, for the question period. And we're going to conduct the question period in a hybrid format using the OWL technology that a lot of you are familiar with. And so we'll need about 10 minutes between the end of the lecture and the beginning of the question period just to make sure that we've got everything set up properly. So 10 minutes after the end of the lecture, we'll gather in room 14 for the question period. And I hope you can join us for both of them. All right, please join me in welcoming Chad Wellmon.
Hi, everybody. So this is I ate in a restaurant for the first time in over a year, about an hour and a half ago. This will be the first time I have given a talk, spoken to colleagues, to people, other than over Zoom, since I think the last week in February. I don't know about you, but my family welcomed the return to civilization, society at least, other people at least, 2 weeks ago, by the prompt introduction of a cold and sinus infection. And so I'm also celebrating the end of that. I guess wearing a mask and obsessively wiping every surface for germs, regardless of whether it helps or not, has effects on people. So it's really great to be here. And as we're talking, historically, as in my past, I variously prepared for lectures. I was nervous, stage fright, as though I'd forgotten how to do this, and maybe I had. So I actually wrote the entire thing out. So maybe I'll learn how to be a speaker again, but differently, or maybe just forget. But I also, the prospect that you'll learn how to be an audience or just differently again sounds fun. Maybe moments of insurrection at my stupidities, my platitudes, that would be a welcome change than docile silence. Anyway, and all of my friends, and I'm sure my 13-year-old daughter with all of her friends, actually that's not happening. Maybe if it were on TikTok, all of you in Zoom land, welcome if you're there. So what I want to do tonight is introduce to myself again, because it's been a while, a new book that's coming out that I wrote with Paul Ryder, a friend and colleague of mine at Ohio State. The book is coming out with Chicago end of July, beginning of August, and it's called Permanent Crisis: The Humanities in a Disenchanted Age. And over the past year, among many possible regrets, imagined regrets, I wish that I had not turned the manuscript, the final revisions, the final copy edit in the first month of the pandemic, so around April. Time. What does it mean now? I don't know. But now, as I sat down over the past several days to try to come up with something to say about this project, I was like, thank God that I didn't have that manuscript over the pandemic. Not only because I would not have had the attention span, but who knows what the exigencies, the contingencies, and just the weirdness of the pandemic would have prompted me to say. And maybe it'll turn out that you would come to different conclusions, I'll come to different conclusions, but so be it. I'm talking about a project that is material now, it's object, it's gone, and it'll be interesting to think about it post-COVID, post whatever this is. So I'm going to do my best to give an overview of what Paul and I were trying to do. I'll speak mostly, though, in the first person because Paul and I think we were trying to do very different things at certain points. And I'll highlight some of those. Occasionally, I'll lapse or purposefully enter in to second person plural. And that's maybe where we agreed on things. But Paul is a wonderful friend, and we've co-written so many things. Another thing I just want to acknowledge, especially here, it dawned on me as I was driving up, sitting on 495 for an hour and a half to travel 10 miles, that Barbara McClay was an undergraduate here. I know Emily, whom I just thank so much for the invitation here, but I think you taught Barbara Dante's Inferno, I think yeah. And the reason I bring up Barbara is because this project, even though the stuff in it has not been published anywhere, the ideas, some of the idioms, the phrases, the real heart of the matter was actually forged in conversations with editors at small magazines. Barbara McClay graduated from St. John's, I believe. I'm not sure, I don't know when, not too long ago. And she was a managing editor at the Hedgehog Review, in her mid-early 20s. And to this day, one of the best kind of intellectual partners I've ever had, and an incredible editor. And I think she has since left the Hedgehog to focus on her own writing. But this project really grew out of conversations with editors like Barbara, like John Baskin at the Point, who was such a good editor that ultimately, I think, killed the essay I was trying to publish with the Point. I take that as a virtue of both the Point and John Baskin. Elizabeth Branch Dyson at Chicago, and a very dear friend of mine, my editor at Hopkins, Matt McAdam, who is here, and despite being an analytically trained philosopher, is also sometimes a good person. So I appreciate that. So this is to the editors. You helped me forge this, and what a gift you are to people who try to write. So you've all seen the charts. You know, the charts that are like this, and then they just dive. The charts of the humanities enrollments, the charts of the humanities jobs, the charts of the humanities in general, the charts of civilizational decline that we're supposed to associate with them. And then perhaps you've also read a blog post or two by Ben Schmidt, or even his 2018 Atlantic article, The Humanities Are in Crisis, where Ben Schmidt, a historian, explained why he had long avoided the word crisis when discussing humanities enrollments in colleges and universities in the US. First, he didn't think that the enrollment figures were all that bad. Even in 2013, they were better than ever in absolute terms. The percentage drops during and after the Great Succession had been gentle, worlds away from the free fall of the mid-1970s. But second, and perhaps more principally, Schmidt admitted to a certain categorical reservation about using such language. And I'm quoting from Schmidt. "One thing I learned earning a history degree," he wrote, "is that people usually announce a crisis so that they can trot out a solution they came up with earlier." By 2018, however, Schmidt, in a blog post entitled Mea Culpa, had changed his mind. New data suggested that the state of the humanities had deteriorated, and as the title of the blog post, then essay, The Humanities Are in Crisis, indicated, now the use of crisis was justified. And Schmidt's message was clear. It was finally time for supporters of the academic humanities to worry. All of this was around the time, 2016, when Paul and I began thinking about these questions. And for me, at least, my questions were something like the following. Okay, the humanities are in crisis. We're supposed to worry, but wait, who's supposed to worry? And what exactly were we supposed to worry about? And why? In 2016, when Paul and I began talking about what would become permanent crisis, those were my questions. And as we began to write together, we realized that we had two primary objects of critique. One, how the notion of a crisis of the humanities has been invoked. And then two, how the notion of a crisis in the humanities has been dismissed. The humanities have always been in crisis. So even if most of the forces besetting the academic humanities aren't new, say vocationalism, managerialism, anti-intellectualism, the present moment is a particularly difficult one for humanities academics, and perhaps those of us in and around universities, and also for those who consider themselves the humanities beneficiaries or defenders. At the same time, and this is me, not necessarily Paul, I also think that crisis talk in the humanities is often peevish, self-serving, lacking in historical perspective, and antithetical to the careful thinking and scholarly virtues to which most humanities scholars otherwise typically aspire, both in their teaching and in their scholarship. As though when we are called to talk to the public, as though when we are called to write op-eds, as though when we are called to do anything but write and talk to our students, we just become stupid, or at least peevish. Permanent crisis takes the crisis of the humanities seriously by uncovering the roots, the graftings, and the transplantings of this persistent sense of crisis surrounding the humanities. In short, since at least the late 19th century, humanities scholars have felt threatened by the very processes that supplied the means for the modern humanities to flourish, such as institutional rationalization, bureaucracy, the democratization of knowledge, or as Nietzsche would have called it, the leveling, and, however understood, secularization. That is, the very processes that allowed people like me to have health insurance, a parking place, and a pension have also been the conditions for the decline of the humanities. And yet, the crisis discourse has also been constructive. Indeed, the self-understanding of the modern humanities didn't merely take shape in response to a perceived crisis, it also made crisis a core part of the project of the humanities. The humanities came into their own, that is, in late 19th century Germany by being framed as, in effect, a privileged resource for resolving perceived crises of meaning and value that threatened other cultural or social goods as well. Whether real or perceived, a crisis can focus attention. It can provide purpose. And in the case of the humanities, the sense of crisis has afforded coherence amid shifts in methods and theories and social and institutional transformations. Regardless of the latest turn, we can take consolation. The crisis is still there. So part of the story of why the humanities are always in crisis is that we have needed them to be in crisis. So the humanities as discourse, or how we talk about the humanities. One feature of humanities crisis talk is that the people who participate in it often presume the existence of some crisis consensus. It is a prior agreement on what the humanities are, as well as a general account of their current condition. And even those of us who do see the humanities as being in crisis don't necessarily think about or experience that crisis or that purported crisis in the same way. So the people who engage in this humanities crisis talk seldom ask, with Kyla Tompkins, is your crisis in the humanities my crisis? Crisis talk also obscures just how disparate and even conflicting concepts of the humanities actually are. To name a few, the humanities are a set of academic disciplines. The humanities are a form of humanism. The humanities are a unique set of skills or ways of knowing. The humanities are a particular kind of self-cultivation. In Permanent Crisis, then, tonight, instead of offering another definition of what the humanities are, I want to show how the signifier, the humanities, came to mean and do what it does. So when a university dean, an op-ed columnist, or the proverbial English professor uses the term the humanities, whether intentionally or not, she is invoking a whole set of commitments, of ideals and sensibilities, qualitative over quantitative reasoning, a celebration of interpretation and awareness toward positivism, an interest in and concern with the subject of knowledge, not simply the objects of knowledge, the valuation of the particular as much as the general. And those are fine, those ideals, those vague ideals. But the problem, I think, with the humanities discourse is that it freezes a certain set of epistemic ideals and values, and it abstracts these ideals and values from the people and the institution and purposes to bring them to life. But the humanities have been and continue to be put to myriad purposes and used to accomplish all sorts of things, as I'll talk about a few examples tonight. So to align oneself with the humanities, then, is implicitly to affirm not simply a bureaucratic arrangement of administrative units, departments, or academic disciplines, but it is also to align oneself with a particular disposition. One takes a stance when one invokes the humanities. And the humanities serve intellectual, cultural, and social functions. They are, as the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey put it in 1882, a bulwark, safeguarding something sacred or valuable against forces that threaten their very existence. That's how he defined the Geisteswissenschaften, or what Paul and I loosely, and I'll talk about this later, call the modern humanities. Now, one of my personal motivations for this admittedly genealogical project, I think, Matt, you asked me a couple of months ago, I don't know if you used the word genealogy, but you definitely used something like skeptical, undermining, or negative. It was negative sounding, right? I just called it genealogical. One of my motivations for this admittedly genealogical project is quite simple. I hope that Permanent Crisis can show that our current university-based system of knowledge, with its particular norms, practices, ideals, and virtues, was not necessary, and that it could have been, and thus can still be, otherwise. Now, before I can explain any of this, before I can continue and explain why I think that the humanities is more of a discourse than a scholarly practice, more of a bureaucratic order than a coherent epistemological project, more of an institutional settlement than an aspirational endeavor, I need you to grant me a pretty big premise. And it's about the discontinuity of the humanities. The continuity, and the premise is this. I'll defend it slightly, but only slightly, so please grant it, at least for the next bit. The continuities between the modern university-based disciplines collectively known as the humanities and earlier forms of humanist knowledge, such as the Studia Humanitatis, have been exaggerated. The modern humanities are not the products of an unbroken tradition reaching back to the Renaissance. And ultimately, I was waiting for lightning to strike me, here in this great hall. I'm sure you've got all kinds of accounts of it. And ultimately to Greek and Roman antiquity. There are important discontinuities and differences, one of which is the persistent discourse of crisis that has characterized the professionalized humanities of the modern research university as it has developed in Germany and then in the United States. Another premise, or point of order, I guess. When I say modern, I'm referring neither to a distinct historical epoch or culture nor to an uncritical claim of contemporary interest. I'm referring instead to the persistent present-mindedness and situatedness of intellectuals and scholars who have tried to define, defend, and justify something like the humanities. In contrast to prior traditions of humanist knowledge, the modern humanities are consistently cast as a particular project to countervail against specific historical forces and problems that threaten a generalized human. The modern humanities address not, say, disordered desires, unruly passions, or the presence of evil. The modern humanities address historical changes, things like industrialization, new technologies, the Soviets, natural science, capitalism, and my favorite that I just discovered over the past week, the abyss of leisure and the prospect of the 10-hour work week. But more on that later, right? So it's this, the modern humanities are overdetermined by their present-mindedness in a way, or maybe just determined. This permanent relationship to the present links the modern humanities to the temporality of crisis. So whereas the temporality of change or development is ongoing, persistent, observable and slow, that of crisis is decisive, is exceptional, in particular. Crisis requires a language suitable for the present moment and situation, a language that communicates the transformative potential of now. And that's why so many of those who claim to speak on behalf of the modern humanities oftentimes do so through exhortation and declaration. Let's get up and do something. So the Studia Humanitatis versus the modern humanities. So although he intermittently studied law at the University of Bologna from 1320 to to 1326, the Italian scholar, poet, and humanist Petrarch was stridently anti-institutional, or so he understood himself. And on his own ignorance and that of many others, 1367, he castigated university-based scholars for their Slavist devotion to the philosopher. Did I just imagine that somebody's wearing an Aristotle hat in the audience? Only at St. John's. So, sorry for the offense. For Petrarch, Aristotle stood in for a monolithic curriculum and the medium through which universities reproduce themselves, that is, strict adherence to a fixed body of learning. Petrarch and the initial generations of humanists in Italy understood their own humanist forms of reading, writing, speaking, thinking, and sociability as protest against those of the university. They upheld the letter, the dialogue, the oration, their preferred forms of communication as superior to the academic lectio passionis. And at the beginning of the 15th century, Florentine citizens, clergy, and even the occasional university teacher gathered regularly in private circles outside universities to read and discuss ancient text, listen to lectures, and practice that most humanist of communicative forms, dialogue. These groups of educated citizens helped establish new modes of socialization adjacent to or outside the university that spread from Rome, Naples, and Krakow to Heidelberg, Augsburg, and Vienna, and elsewhere across Northern Europe. Of course, Anne Blair is one of our best scholars and thinkers about the relationship between these humanist forms of knowledge and communication and proto-forms of natural and physical sciences, technicians, engineers. And I'll come back to that at the very end, this moment where humanist forms of knowledge not only seep out beyond the university, but flourish there. So over the course of the 15th century, however, humanist scholars gradually abandoned their anti-university posture, and many of them sought out university positions, like me, right? Healthcare, a salary, an office, interlibrary loan. The things that make me flourish destroy my soul. So in so doing, they helped establish the Studia Humanitatis as elements of the Faculty of Arts in universities across Europe. And although they became institutional insiders, the process of accommodating and reinventing humanist scholarly practices as the Studia Humanitatis was complex, contentious, and long. And I'll highlight just two elements of this process as a way of contrasting the Studia Humanitatis to the established university system of knowledge. And I want to pay another debt here to Chris Salenza. I think he's back. He's back at Hopkins, the great scholar of the Renaissance. First, these are two elements that how the Studia Humanitatis challenged or how they came to sit within the system of knowledge that was the University of the Middle Ages. So first, the Studia Humanitatis conceived of the ends of knowledge differently. That is, they had different conceptions of use and utility. So initially, at least, the term Studia Humanitatis didn't signify the pursuit of theological, metaphysical, or philosophical knowledge, or, as some contemporary commenters claim about the modern humanities, the cultivation or training of the soul as an end in itself. But they propounded a more modest notion that the kinds of technical skills and knowledge humanists taught, reading, writing, and speaking about ancient Latin and Greek texts, helped prepare students for study in the higher faculty, as well as for lives as active citizens, friends, and family members. The 15th century Florentine statesman and teacher Leonardo Bruni, for example, described the Studia Humanitatis as a combination of literary skill and factual knowledge. The aims, that is, of early humanist scholars, Petrarch and his more contemporary, and teachers like Bruni were more quotidian, more practical, even more technical. In short, more tightly circumscribed than later scholars have made them out to be. So the Studia Humanitatis could certainly be practiced, enjoyed, and taught for goods and satisfaction that were intrinsic to them as distinct activities, of course. But they could also, and not in opposition, and not as a contradiction, be put to instrumental, useful, and external ends. They were, after all, arts, techniques of writing, speaking, and reasoning. And the professionals educated in the higher faculties, the lawyers, the doctors, the church bureaucrat, and priest, they needed these skills. Second, the Studia Humanitatis were the intellectual other. That's a horrible, I don't write sentences like that. But it's the first time back in a year. So they were the intellectual other the dyad of theology. And this point will come back later as very important. So in the context of the university, the Studia Humanitatis were structurally, ethically, and epistemologically juxtaposed to theology. They did different stuff in each of these registers. The Renaissance humanist conception of knowledge as erudition, as bound to human language in the material forms it assumed in text, distinguished it from the then predominant theological conception of knowledge as metaphysical inquiry. The Studia Humanitatis considered human things, which included a vast array of arts, recovered from ancient texts, from poetry and painting to natural philosophy and mining. The Studium Divinitatis, or scholastic theology, considered the divine in reason itself. Until at least the 17th century, the fault line separating the study of divinity from, as one English writer put it in 1483, humanity, remained the most important institutional and intellectual division of knowledge. That was the fault line. Declining enrollments. So after an initial golden age over the 15th and 16th centuries, the Studia Humanitatis, the arts faculties, the lower faculty, suffered through more than 2 centuries of decline, their institutional fate being bound up with the tumult of the arts, sometimes the philosophy faculty, sometimes called the philosophy faculties, in universities across Europe. For much of the 17th and 18th century, professors in these same faculties were subjected to the indignities of sitting at the bottom of a hierarchy, atop of which, especially in Northern European universities, reigned the theology faculty. Arts faculties offerings appeared last in course catalogs. Arts faculty appeared last in the faculty marches. They had the least ornate robes, and they earned the lowest amount for their lectures. As secondary schools gradually assumed the preparatory function of the arts faculty in training students in rhetoric and other areas of humanist study over the course of the 17th and 18th century, enrollments in these faculties declined, and by the end of the 18th century, the last collapse of the humanities perhaps, enrollments in arts and philosophies faculties, the lower faculty, declined so precipitously that at several universities in German-speaking lands, they approached zero and would remain so until the beginning of the 19th century and kind of the second go of German-speaking universities. So from reading and writing to moral formation. So again, what I'm trying to, I guess this is no longer a premise when you elaborate for this long, is it? Right? I could have just said it as a premise. I'm trying to elaborate this discontinuity between something like the Studia Humanitatis and the modern humanities. Because if you don't buy that, then the project just fails. And it doesn't make any sense. So the entry for Humaniora or the Studia Humanitatis in Zedler's Großes Vollständiges Lexikon, like this beautiful German kind of lexicon from that was published between, I think, 1730, 1750 in Germany, crystallizes the tumult that I'm talking about here. So I've talked about it institutionally, historically, and here in a sense kind of etymologically, conceptually. It's also one of the first signs of a now discernible transformation of the Studia Humanitatis into what I'm calling the modern humanities. So, about the entry. After a string of rather standard definitions of the Studia Humanitatis as a preparatory element in a broader university curriculum, as technical skills and capacities considered necessary for all of the higher or professional faculties in study, the entry tells readers that a growing, quote, prejudice against studying anything that doesn't meet an immediate need has led people to dismiss the Studia Humanitatis as, quote, impractical arts. And for this reason, the entry concludes, almost grudgingly, that's the great thing about these old dictionaries, 18th, 17th century dictionaries, they're rhetorical masterpieces sometimes. So it concludes almost grudgingly that those who dedicate themselves, quote, exclusively and solely to studying the Studia Humanitatis, despite all of this, they deserve our praise. So in suggesting that these historical and technical arts could be practiced for their own sake as ends in themselves, or at least not as without any worth, the Zedler entry anticipates the transformation of the problem of the Studia Humanitatis, that is, justification by method and technique, as opposed to moral edification, into that of the modern humanities, right? So the transformation that I'm tracking here with kind of this shift is a justification of the Studia Humanitatis by method, by technique, by skill, as opposed to a justification of something like the modern humanities as a justification by moral edification and transformation. That is, it points to the growing gap between the Studia Humanitatis as a limited but necessary preparatory training for cultured elites on the one hand, and the humanities as a self-sufficient moral resource on the other. And so over the next half century, intellectuals and scholars, especially in German-speaking lands, sought to transform the Studia Humanitatis and all those arts that had settled into the lower faculty of the university into an explicitly moral and philosophical project, tying them to the human and reason as universals, as ends in themselves, by drawing an analogy between human intellection and the divine mind, glossing a lot here. Kant, the new humanist, the idealist, and the early romantics who followed him ascribed the capacity for spontaneous creative reason to humans, conceiving of it in terms traditionally limited to, quote, the mind of God. And in so doing, they elevated the activities and the creations of the human mind above the merely technical, the merely useful, the merely necessary. These intellectual activities and objects to which they gave form were ends in themselves. And crucially, they identified, and this is important, think here, for example, Kant's Conflict of the Faculty, 1798, but also the entire litany of what many people refer to as kind of the Humboldtian tradition of the university. So crucially, not only kind of these philosophical assertions and claims, but they also identified the university, and in particular, no longer the arts faculty, but what they newly christened the philosophy faculty, as the primary institution of this human development project. And so it's not incidental then that one of the first documented uses of the word humanism occurred at this time. In 1808, the philosopher and educational reformer Friedrich Niethammer coined humanism, in a polemic against school reformers seeking more practical pedagogical training. Humanism, he wrote, referred not simply to the study of the, quote, so-called humaniora in the learned schools, but also to the pedagogy of antiquity, whose essential feature was the elevation of students' humanity over his animality. I mean, he's just glossing Kant here. And so in a conflation that would eventually characterize the modern humanities, Niethammer further defined humanism as both a curricular program, the study of ancient texts via humanist scholarly traditions, and a moral project with an underlying philosophical anthropology. That is, he envisioned the transformation of the Studia Humanitatis into a pedagogical project oriented toward the idea of the human in itself, quote, as well as its vocation. No longer subordinate to the professionalizing interest of the higher faculties, law, medicine, and theology, or to the confessional ends of the Studium Divinitatis, the newly conceived humanities would constitute their own institution and pedagogical system that would safeguard reason over instrumental rationality, the human mind over animal body. And just as importantly, Niethammer juxtaposed what he called the new humanities with those, and I'm quoting directly from Niethammer, those branches of knowledge, such as mathematics, physics, chemistry, which are more immediately related to material production, more immediately useful, things of practical use and practical utility. And he reads like an anxious culture critic. So I'm just gonna, this is a gloss, but I'm kind of drawing directly from him. It's so great. Dinesh D'Souza is, no, it's not that bad. So it had, quote, so here's the gloss. In a German culture consumed by the drive for money and profit, devoted to, this is the word, big agricultural, forestry, manufacturing, commerce, and industrialization, this is 1808. Technical and mechanical know-how has triumphed over pure, non-instrumental knowledge and corrupted educational institutions, religions, traditions, and every element of human moral development, i.e. Bildung. So in the context of such cultural and spiritual loss, I mean, that's a lot has been lost, I guess. Only the new humanities could guarantee what he calls the full development, the full Bildung of humanity. Niethammer underscored this compensatory rule by redrawing the divisions of knowledge. And so instead of comparing the humanities to theology as the Studia Humanitatis or the humaniores, right, the literature humaniores, the studying of things more human than divine, as had historically been done, he pitted the humanities against the natural and the physical sciences. And in this sense, the new humanities were fundamentally modern because they served not some antiquarian curiosity, not some reordering of desire on an Augustine program, but the explicit needs of the present, but also the future. Of course, 75 years later, in 1883, Wilhelm Dilthey, in Introduction to the Geisteswissenschaften, offered a more systematic account of Niethammer's claim that when he argued that the modern humanities satisfied, quote, a need by compensating for the alienating effects of an industrial and technical modern society. That's how the introduction to the modern Geisteswissenschaften begins. It gives an account of an industrializing Berlin and the need for compensation, the need for new functions of something called the humanities. Now, over the past 100 years, a similar structural logic, that is, over the 20th century, the long kind of 20th century, a similar structural logic, more institutional and social than ethical or epistemological, has governed the discourse of the humanities and its institutional home, the modern university. The humanities compensate for, replace, transcend, ameliorate the losses of modernization, the alienation, the rationalization, the technologicalization, the loss of a life world, etc. That the modern humanities have been in permanent crisis then stands to reason. They've overpromised and so repeatedly failed to do what has been expected of them. So that's kind of the discontinuity that's crucial to the project. And now I just want to give 3 brief examples of how this permanent crisis has played out. I think one of which is 19th century Germany, and then 2 of which we're going to shift over to 20th century US. So in 1820, less than a decade after his philology seminar had been established at the new university in Berlin, August Burke lamented, the philologist, lamented that most philologists had, quote, no concept of the internal relationship of the different parts of philology, by which he meant they had no real concept of philology as an ethical whole, that is, as philological practice. Instead, they simply pursued their own highly specialized work with a, quote, thoughtlessness that rendered it routine, that rendered philology mechanical. Now, Burke worried that the doing of philology was becoming detached from the being of a philologist, right? The living out of philology, detached from its own internal ideals, its values and virtues. The very elements that constituted what he asserted was philology as an ethical practice, but most importantly, as a scholarly community. And so in his own elegiac way, I think Burke identified the permanent crisis of the humanities, that is the triumph and tragedy of bureaucratic knowledge. Because on the one hand, philologists had achieved disciplinary and social autonomy, or were on their way to doing this by rationalizing their practice, by bureaucratizing it, transforming philology into a specialized university-based form of knowledge. So they policed their own boundaries that they largely established. They began to write the history of their own discipline and themselves as once, but now, as Burke would put it elsewhere, liberated from theology, but also law and history. That was crucial. They edited, contributed, and communicated through their own periodicals, right? Philology journals were some of the first to really develop their own identity. They had their own seminars, they had their own societies, and they even had their own labor market. That is essentially the German gymnasium, right? One of the biggest qualifications to teach in the gymnasium was training at the university level in philology. So that's on the one hand, right? So the benefits of bureaucracy: jobs, periodicals, positions, status. But on the other hand, philologists had achieved so much of this by becoming part of that modern machine, the modern research university. Not yet, but it was slowly becoming so. Highly rationalized bureaucratic system. Philological knowledge was becoming bureaucratic knowledge, its goals, its traditions, its ideals, its norms, big and small n, and guidelines and practices, and even its ideal figure, the persona of the modern philologist, were largely shaped and largely came into the full flowering as part of this very transformed institution. And here, I think I'll just put a concept out there, value capture, right? So the transposition of the values and virtues particular or what somebody like Brooke assumed were particular to philology, onto those of the emergent institution of the research university. So for example, you're facing big questions like, what constituted unity, however ideal or normative, within this new institution? Was it shared practices and common ideals and virtues? Or was it the interest and maintenance of that bigger institutional structure? What are we fighting for? Community of scholars, sharing a practice, or the institution that sets out the institutional conditions of possibility for that community to flourish now? Could the virtues and values internal to the practice of philology be sustained, or would they need to be more communicable, made more communicable, more portable, more legible to scholars and bureaucratic officials? Although in 19th century Prussia, the Venn diagram of that was like this. And actually, Schleiermacher is the first comment I've read about that, about how awesome it would be if all Prussian bureaucrats had PhDs in philology or history, perhaps. So these values, they had to become legible not only across the institution, but increasingly beyond it, right? Particularly in the Prussian bureaucracy. So expertise and epistemic authority. So philological research was justified not because it led to a more humane person, but because it led to the formation of the disciplinary self. Brooke, this is in his encyclopedia, which a series of lectures introducing Berlin students to philology that he delivered between 1830, 1850, 1855, almost on a yearly basis. The humanities, Humanitätsstudium, he writes, the models of scholarship underlying 18th century conceptions of philology should not be conflated with philology, modern philology as a disciplinary-based practice. Philosophy so understood as Humanitätsstudium, so the study of humanity, of things human, served the development of, quote, the purely human. But that was not what distinguished philology and gave philology its authority. What gave philology its authority in 19th century Prussia was its specialized bureaucratic character, its capacity to establish, credentialize, and legitimize experts. And so here you can hear the fault line between intellectual discipline and moral formation, intellectual virtue and moral virtue, Wissenschaft and Bildung. Over the course of the 19th century, this distinction was blurred and oftentimes became even irrelevant. And today, of course, standing up here, the notion that the philologist could be this exemplary figure is ludicrous. Maybe not here. But in lots of places, it seems ludicrous that the philologist could be a trustworthy source of expert and useful knowledge. It's perhaps laughable, or at least very Prussian. But the persona of the disciplined philologist was, I would say, one of the first fully developed figures of modern social authority. The expert, the professional, whose training came to stand in for moral virtue, trustworthy knowledge, practical action, and political power. One premise of the modern research university was intellectual and moral formation were sufficiently analogous and of a kind that the authority and legitimacy of a specialized and technical knowledge, that is, of the expert, need not be limited to the university, but rather could and even ought to be extended out beyond the bounds of the university. But Brooke's own doubts about whether the gap between ethos and method, Bildung and Wissenschaft, could be bridged have proven, I'd argue, well-founded and even prescient, especially as concerns the permanent crisis of the humanities. That's example number one, right? So bureaucracy sets the conditions for philology to flourish. And if you've read anything about 19th century German philology, spelled its demise, right? Or so the story goes. This permanent tension. So the not natural scientific disciplines. In 1898, Heinrich Rickert and several of his philosophy faculty colleagues at the University of Freiburg, if the name rings a bell or doesn't, a neo-Kantian teacher of Heidegger, roommate and friend of Max Weber. So his faculty colleagues at the University of Freiburg met to discuss the possibility of organizing a scholarly society as what they called a counterpoint to the one that the natural scientists had established at the university almost 80 years earlier, the Freiburg Society of Physical Scientists, whose purpose, according to its founding bylaws, was established in 1821, was the advancement of the Naturwissenschaften, so the advancement of the natural sciences. So at that first gathering of these scholars, from, as Rickard reported, theology, jurisprudence, history, philology, political economy, and, as he put it, maybe also philosophy, the question of nomenclature arose. So whereas the biologists, chemists, geologists, and physiologists never doubted what bound them together as, quote, men of the Naturwissenschaften, or men of the natural scientist, those gathered that day in Freiburg did not immediately know what, as he wrote, common activity gave its group their coherence, though they presumed there must be one. That's why we're here. And so this is directly from Rickard's accounting of this meeting. So true, we agreed on the term the Society for the Science of Culture, Kulturwissenschaft. But the only reason why no one objected is that no one had something better to propose. And so it was this continued what he called lack, not just of a meaningful name, but also of a shared concept of their common methods, their common interests, their common tasks, their common purpose, that Rickard's colleagues invited him to address in the Society's first lecture. So several weeks later, in a lecture that he titled Cultural Science and Natural Science, Rickard began with a diagnosis of how convoluted, as he put it, the problem of the organization of the sciences, the Wissenschaften, had become in German universities. Again, this is in 1898. The sciences had fallen into two interest groups, with jurists, theologians, and philologists and historians in one camp, and physicists, chemists, biologists, and geologists in the other. And yet, whereas the men of, quote, the natural sciences could readily give an account of themselves, the other group continued, despite the efforts of all the philosophers at the university, to lack a common name for what they did, but also, more importantly, a clear concept of their methods. So part of this incapacity was a matter of historical priority. Rickard thought that the development of the natural sciences, as did Dilthey, had long preceded anything that could be considered the humanities. The humanities were latecomers. Over the course of the 19th century, the natural sciences had ossified into a natural scientific Weltanschauung, whose premises, methods, and practices rested on metaphysical and methodological naturalism, of which both its practitioners and the broader publics who confessed it, belief in it, remained profoundly ignorant. Right? Natural science had become a habit. So, drawn together, this group that Rickard of his colleagues, all the colleagues who weren't members of the Society of Physical and Natural Scientists, he provided a name. So drawn together by their opposition to this unrivaled and for many of them increasingly illegitimate authority of the natural sciences, Rickard said, "You know what we're all in search of?" And I quote, "We are all in search of the not natural scientific disciplines, the nicht naturwissenschaftlichen Disziplinen, disciplines that had the coherence and relative autonomy of the natural sciences simply by dint of not being the natural sciences." And that's what he called them. That's what we are. We are the not natural scientific disciplines. Now, the story of Rickard and his he came up with better names, of course, if you follow his work. Better, but actually I think this is the best. Kulturwissenschaft, he would return to that. When he kind of still continued his lifelong kind of devotion to working on values, kind of a value theory. But I think this encapsulates this permanent crisis, the not natural scientific disciplines. The story of Rickard and his not natural scientific colleagues in Freiburg, as well as many others like it, counters the standard narrative of the two cultures debate and the fate of the humanities in a modern age. Such a narrative is typically based on two premises. The first is that the humanities refers to a coherent tradition that stretches at least back to the Studia Humanitatis of the 14th and 15th centuries, and therefore assumes that the humanities preceded the natural and physical sciences. This is related to the second. The second is that the humanities lost ground in meaning to the natural and physical sciences. That is, that they fell victim to the alienating and fragmenting effects of their modernizing, empiricizing, technologizing ways. On such accounts, the fate of the humanities could be understood as a subplot in a grand subtraction thesis of secularization. So modernity gradually but inevitably came to slough off the humanities as another enchanted element of the past, and eventually the logic of modernity, so go these stories, leads to the obsolescence of the humanities and the increasing power of the natural and physical sciences and technological progress. Obviously, I think this is all backwards. The emergence of the modern humanities was a rearguard action by late 19th century German intellectuals, at least in this context that I'm talking about, anxious to rescue what they feared was an endangered moral vision, namely, the autonomous and morally capable human. Germany's educated elite invoked the modern humanities, then imbued them with the potential to make meaning and provide the moral and social resources that had long been associated with religious communities and orthodoxies. The chemist and rector of the University of Berlin, August Wilhelm von Hofmann, was one such intellectual. Also a member of the academy as a chemist, rector of the University of Berlin as a chemist, so a pretty paid up chemist. Testifying to the personal consolations of ancient Greek literature, and this seems like a St. John's appropriate story, he told his Berlin colleagues in 1881, assembled there at the university, that, quote, reading Homer refreshes one's life. The civil servant's hoary face, in which time has etched the unmistakable trace of bureaucratic monotony, is transfigured when, on the occasion, the sonorous hexameter of the Iliad unexpectedly rings in our ear. What the Bible does for the masses, Homer does for the educated. This was a therapeutic humanities for a bureaucratic and industrial age. So the shift to America. But as a coherent set of disciplines and institutionalized in universities and colleges, the humanities are primarily, I would argue, an invention of American higher education between 1930 and 1950. This is intently institutional argument there. Importantly, it was also American intellectuals and scholars who untethered the humanities from the roots in classical philology, and crucially, claimed them as a resource for democracy. That was a profoundly different project, radically distinct. Felix E. Schelling, a University of Pennsylvania professor of English and Shakespeare scholar, laid out the project in a 1902 address to the Phi Beta Kappa Society of University of Pennsylvania, when he spoke about the humanities gone and to come. So whereas past generations had successfully nurtured the classics, by which he meant ancient Greek and Roman literature, present and future generations, he argued, would have to cultivate what he called, quote, a broader conception of the humanities in order to do battle with an unprecedented threat. Here I'm quoting directly from him. The humanities today, he said, are front to front with an attack in comparison with which all previous menaces sink into insignificance. We are in a struggle for the very principle of liberality in education itself, and worst of all, our enemy is within, Schelling said. Practical utility is by far the most insidious enemy of modern education and the chief barrier to the attainment of that higher and spiritual life toward which the nobler members of the race are striving. So for Schelling, the gradual but near total triumph of scientific and technical education in American colleges and universities, I think what he's talking about here is the dissolution of the classical college curriculum, the Moral Act, which shifted a lot of funds to founding state technical schools, but also the liberal arts, liberal education is explicitly mentioned there. He doesn't mention that. And the ascendance of the more, quote, modern courses in the natural and physical sciences had introduced a small-hearted disregard for the full capacities of humankind. Now, Schelling conceded that their methods and what he considered their twin technical education had yielded great practical benefits. Who didn't like a transcontinental railroad? But they also promoted a utilitarian disposition that threatened to reduce all things humans to an endless calculation of economic value, thereby rendering all liberal pursuits without value. So in language that anticipated the sprawling civilizational critiques of modern science and technology by Louis Mumford, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer in the 1930s and 40s, Schelling warned that the technical, by which he meant the combined cultural influence and power of technology and the sciences, was poised to obliterate, his words, human nature. More than mere study of Greek and Roman classics, then, what he called the humanities to come, Schelling concluded, in language that spiraled into ever-graded levels of abstraction, would be what he called the untechnical studies, unprofessional studies. And their goal was to educate, to elevate, and to humanize, and in so doing, to negotiate cultural crisis. Now, Schelling's rhetoric marked a significant shift in the American context at the beginning of a new century. The discourse of the humanities moved away from the more limited and often technical aims of the Studia Humanitatis and philology related to the study of ancient Greek and Roman literature or the classics, and toward the ideal of the modern humanities as invoked by Dilthey, Rickard, and the German scholars who preceded him. In the years following Schelling's talk, the term acquired new institutional meanings and structures. Scholars from previously disparate disciplines, philology, literature, arts, art history, philosophy, and religion, joined together to cast the humanities as a cultural compensation for the moral and spiritual deprivations of natural and physical sciences and the emergent technologies. Between 1928 and 1941, university presidents and deans, leaders of private philanthropic foundations, the Rockefeller Center was important. They gave the money to establish this special program in humanities at Princeton, for example, of which Said was that's where he got his BA from Princeton. Sorry, that was an aside based on a dinner conversation. An even corporate executive used the humanities in a way that Schelling had pioneered in his Philadelphia speech. That is, they marshaled the term to signify a collective set of academic disciplines and dispositions, and they repeated again and again the rhetoric of crisis that cast the humanities as simultaneously the imperiled victim, but also the privileged redeemer. And they also introduced numerous courses and comprehensive programs first identified as the humanities, the first humanities divisions. And by 1950, many of America's leading universities had institutionalized these promises and oppositions in departmental and divisional structures we now know today as the humanities. The Cold War humanities, and this is where I'll end. The effort to institutionalize the modern humanities and to establish a function not only at local levels, but also at the national level received a big boost by Cold War liberals in the early 1960s, when the American Council of Learned Societies, the ACLS, the Council of Graduate Schools in America, and the United Chapters of Phi Beta Kappa established the National Commission on the Humanities. And they charged that committee with conducting a study of, quote, the state of the humanities in America. A year later, the committee released what was titled A Report on the Committee of the Humanities, and this would kind of get the gears rolling for the founding of the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, a few years later. The report argued that the nation's social, moral, and aesthetic development lagged behind its unmatched and enviable technological and material progress. This gap between techno-scientific progress and moral development, it claimed, was based on the crisis created by, quote, the contemporary state of the humanities. That is, the humanities had created its own crisis. I guess that's how the logic is supposed to go. But what was the danger? The danger was of wavering purpose. Again, this is height of the Cold War. The nation needed not just a nuclear arsenal and greater economic productivity, it also needed beliefs, vision, and my favorite, excellence in things spiritual. These were the products of what they called the humanities. But now, in my conclusion, I want to focus on what the report claimed was the final and perhaps the most pressing need, but also the most pressing danger, what they called the abyss of leisure. In addition to all these sorts of social compensation, the familiar lacunae and the lacks that I've talked about this evening associated with the modern humanities, the report named one final need, one most proximate danger. And it's so great. It's point number 5 in the needs section. I'm just going to read briefly from it. The 40-hour work week and the likelihood of a shorter one, the greater life expectancy and the earlier ages of retirement have combined to make the blessing of leisure a source of personal and community concern. What shall I do with my spare time? All too quickly becomes the question, who am I? What shall I make of my life? And the humanities are the immemorial answer to man's questioning and to his need for self-expression. They are, concluded the report, uniquely equipped to fill the abyss of leisure. So given the expectation that economic growth would continue its post-war pace in terms of GDP and rates of productivity, the 10-hour work week and the prospect of leisure time posed a personal and political problem. And the humanities could be used locally and federally as spiritual and perhaps most importantly, a political narcotic, a worthy distraction for the youth from political unrest then unfolding on campuses across the country. It's no accident, of course, that alongside, I think it was James Watson Jr., then CEO of IBM, a whole bunch of other powerful men, Clark Kerr was also on this committee. Kerr, of course, a member of the committee, was also at that point president of the University of California. And he wrote around the same time that the function of the humanities, both within the university and society more broadly, was, quote, to provide leisure for a largely satisfied, or soon to be satisfied, university-educated middle-class consumer. The humanities function as both a highbrow alternative to lowbrow mass culture and, significantly, as a prophylactic, a preventative measure against political unrest that would inevitably arise from abundant leisure time. When people start reading good books, they're going to cause problems for the state. So the humanities have to be reconceptualized, not as provocative, but as distracting. Now, as I've tried to suggest, the mandarins of modernity have certainly lamented the Prussianization, the professionalization, as profanations of the humanities, the university, and higher learning in general. But I've also tried to suggest that the formal education in the institutions of higher learning, including universities, but I would add to this, monasteries, courts, libraries, laboratories, academies, have always helped to cultivate and sustain the people in the practices of reading, writing, and thinking well, even as they have also satisfied the more ostensibly instrumental, professional, and technical goals and purposes of those who come to them to learn and to train. I think we can do two things at once. But there's something insidious about this final turn of the permanent crisis. Something I find just downright evil, to be honest. Because I find most forms of the permanent crisis of the humanities pretty reasonable. Bureaucracy, commercialization, rationalization, technological change, democratization, secularizations of all sorts. They shape the conditions of intellectual life. They give rise to the contradictions, the difficulties, but also the joys, I would say, of trying to make sense of this world and make it better by reading and writing and talking about it. But there's something particularly pernicious in this final, and I would say even perhaps now dominant, crisis of the humanities, right? Crisis in the abyss of leisure. In the way that the collective committee author of the report rips leisure from its various etymological roots and inverts the, dare I say, purpose of leisure and some of those severed meanings and traditions. Because, of course, leisure has a relationship pretty direct with skole, right? The work of leisure is the work of leisure or free time, time free from the necessity of labor. And it requires attention, it requires care, it requires love. The opposite of distraction, the opposite of what needs to be sublimated. So for Aristotle, such free time or leisure was the precondition of the most valuable sorts of thought and action, and in particular, for the sort of thought that is an end in itself. And we can see this in the etymologies of skole, from school to scholar. And so as my friend and philosopher Tal Brewer puts it, according to this characteristically Greek view, leisure opens the possibility of genuinely free thought born of wonder and free to unfold in accordance with its own internal demands, rather than thought born of consciousness of lack or need. So I think I can deal with bureaucracy, I think I can deal with certain forms of commercialization, rationalization, technological change, but it's this narcotic effect of leisure and of the humanities, this distraction that that's just not good. And I'm going to end there because I have nothing else to say about that. So.